Right, we now come to the urgent question. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Foreign Secretary what steps he will take to support Jimmy Lai during his trial and whether he will call for his immediate and unconditional release.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has called on the Hong Kong authorities to end their prosecution of Jimmy Lai and release him. He also urged the Chinese authorities to repeal the national security law and end the prosecution of all individuals charged under it. The Foreign Secretary and I welcome the opportunity to meet Mr. Lai's son Sebastian again last week to listen to his concerns as the trial approached. As the Foreign Secretary has made clear, Mr. Lai's prosecution is politically motivated. He has faced multiple charges to discredit and silence him. As an outspoken journalist and publisher, he has been targeted in a clear attempt to stop the peaceful exercise of his rights to freedom of expression and association. The Foreign Secretary raised Mr. Lai's prosecution with Foreign Minister Wang Yi on the 5th of December, as his predecessor did in Beijing on the 30th of August. We will continue to press for Mr. Lai's release with the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities. Mr. Speaker, diplomats from our Consulate General attended court today as a visible sign of the UK's support, and they will continue to do so. We will continue to press for consular access to Mr. Lai, which the Hong Kong prison authorities have repeatedly refused. China considers anyone of Chinese heritage born in China to be a Chinese national. They do not recognise other nationalities and therefore consider Mr. Lai to be exclusively Chinese. More broadly, we have made clear the national security law has damaged Hong Kong and its way of life. Rights and freedoms have been significantly eroded and arrests under the law have silenced opposition voices. It is a clear breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the legally binding UN-registered treaty which China willingly entered into. Its continued existence and use is a demonstration of China breaking its international commitments. We will continue to stand up for the people of Hong Kong, to call out violations of their rights and freedoms, and to hold China to its international obligations.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her response. Jimmy Lai is and has always been a full British citizen. He has never held a Chinese passport and therefore should have been publicly recognised by the government some time ago. But let me welcome the change in rhetoric from the Foreign Secretary in his comments today, where he said Jimmy Lai is a British citizen and has called on the Chinese government to release him. I'm pleased this seems to have been a shift in policy. However, notwithstanding it, I do recall a number of times myself and my honourable friends have raised this issue about his citizenship to no avail with the Foreign Office up until now. At the heart of this lies the Sino-British Agreement, and I recall at the time of its signing that the Ambassador to Beijing, Percy Craddock, said of China's leaders that they may be thuggish dictators, but they were men of their word and could be trusted to do what they promise. Well, how history always shows us wrong. You cannot trust thuggish dictators, and they have trashed the Sino-British Agreement without so much as a by your leave. Instead, we now have political persecution, destruction of press freedoms, forced confessions, and the targeting of foreign nationals as a matter of course. This national security law is the key because it has been stripping away their rights, and particularly now Jimmy Lai's rights, who faces lifetime in prison. There is a new axis, I believe, of totalitarian states that is formed. They include China, of course, North Korea, Russia, Iran and Syria, and we must be on our toes if we are not to realise that their target is democracy itself. So given that, will the government now reconsider its words in the integrated review and reinstate the idea that China is a systemic threat, not just to us, but to the very values that we seek? I must tell the government that an individual already known to me and some others is being used in the persecution of Jimmy Lai. We know that he has been tortured to give evidence, and clearly his evidence therefore cannot be relied upon. In light of this, will the government give a commitment today that if and when the UK or other citizens are targeted by Jimmy Lai through the evidence of Jimmy Lai's trial, concrete actions will be taken to protect them, and to do this working alongside our allies, the US, Japan and others in Europe? This is a very serious issue that may yet erupt. Will the government now sanction John Lee and others responsible for the Hong Kong's national security law? After all, the US have sanctioned 10 and we have sanctioned none. Is the UK government considering how to allow Hong Kong asylum applications to switch to BNO applications to save all the heartache? And as we approach Christmas, Mr. Speaker, this brave and devoted Christian will see it.
I'm sorry, but you're way over. I'm sure that some other honourable people will bring in the other points. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think we all agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman that the great tragedy of the Sino-British Joint Declaration being breached and the national security law, which, as the Foreign Secretary set out, is one which we are calling on Hong Kong authorities to repeal, is breaching so many of those values which we understood China was willing to maintain with Hong Kong after 1997. The Right Honourable Gentleman mentions the Integrated Review Refresh, where the Prime Minister set out very clearly our perspective that we consider China to be an epoch-defining challenge. This then sets out in very great deal a number of the areas of concern around China, around economic coercive activity, and we continue to work closely with G7 and other partners around the world to tackle that and to work together to try and persuade China to reverse some of those policies. Importantly, obviously, Mr. Speaker, and I say it a lot at the dispatch box as the Sanctions Minister, I listen very closely, as do all of us and our officials in the Foreign Office, on all issues of potential future sanctions. We continue to look at those under the global human rights sanctions regulations in this arena, but of course we do not speculate about future sanctions designations because of course that could reduce their impact.
We have Shadow Minister Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the ongoing detention of Jimmy Lai, a British citizen, is a stark symbol of the decline of Hong Kong's freedoms and China's flagrant disregard for the legally binding Sino-British Agreement, which promised a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kongers for 50 years. His trial is a further chapter in the erosion of the liberties promised then to the people of Hong Kong. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and I have met with Jimmy's son Sebastian on a regular occurrence and made Labour's position unequivocally clear that Jimmy must be released immediately and the national security law he is being charged under is abhorrent. I welcome the intervention by the new Foreign Secretary as Mr Lai's trial begins today, but there must be sustained interest in this by the government in a way which has been sorely lacking until now. We cannot sit idly by while British citizens experience a politically motivated trial while the authorities attempt to stifle freedom of expression. I urge the Minister to give a firm commitment right here that the Foreign Secretary's intervention will not be a one-off, but that the government will follow Labour's lead in sustained, consistent and full-throated support for Mr Lai, his legal counsel, and for putting the freedoms promised to the people of Hong Kong at the top of her agenda.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as both the Indo-Pacific Minister, within which China and Hong Kong are in my purview, and indeed as the Sanctions Minister, the issue of Jimmy Lai and others held in this way are very much at the top of my agenda, always have been and always will remain so. I have met Sebastian Lai on a number of occasions this year, working closely with him and his team to both understand and look for the support we can provide. The frustration being, of course, that we are not able to provide consular access because we are not allowed to visit him in prison. The Foreign Secretary, as I set out and he set out yesterday, have called for his release, and we will continue to sustain that throughout the course of the trial. We expect the trial at the moment to last some 80 days, so we expect to see that wrap up in the summer, and we will be working very closely with like-minded partners. Today, Mr. Speaker, there were at court both US, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, European and Swiss representatives also there to make it clear that we all have one view, that this is a trial from which Jimmy Lai needs to be released.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very interested in the question of Mr Lai's nationality status. Could my right honourable friend confirm that if he is a full British citizen, whether Hong Kong has unilaterally withdrawn consular rights for foreign missions to visit their citizens in prison, or whether this is specifically in the case of those imprisoned under the national security law? Whichever it is, could she confirm that the Foreign Office has done everything possible to make sure that the Hong Kong government realises these rights of access for our citizens should not be violated lightly?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right that consular access should, in an ideal world, be provided to all those who find themselves in prison, whatever country. The frustrating fact is that where dual nationality is considered the case by a country in question, not specifically China, it is up to that country to determine whether indeed they think that dual national, we consider obviously British, they will have a British passport, is acceptable. We have absolutely done everything, and we continue to ask for consular access for Jimmy Lai. I was able to help him get a new passport earlier in the year because his old one had run out, and the Home Office and we worked together to ensure that. We are very, very comfortable and certain that he is indeed a British citizen, but as I set out in my statement, Mr Speaker, the Hong Kong authorities consider that if a Hong Kong national was born in mainland China, they consider that to be a Chinese citizen, and hence the dual nationality that they consider, and therefore the impossibility of our authority to visit him in prison at the moment.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this question. I may also thank Lord Dalton, Baroness Kennedy and the Honourable Member for Strangford for their continuing and unwavering support for Jimmy Lai, who as a UK national was and is, I believe, entitled to expect much more support from the government than he has thus far received. A 76-year-old pro-democracy campaigner with ailing health who has been in prison for more than 1,000 days on trumped-up charges. Yet it was only yesterday that the government, his government, finally called on him to be released. And I hoped I'd misunderstood the Minister, but are we to believe that the UK's influence is so diminished that we cannot get access to Mr Lai in prison? And could she detail what practical support has been given to him now that his show trial has started? And in the event that Beijing gets the verdict that it's looking for, can the Minister give a cast-iron guarantee that the government will proactively come to this House to make an statement on what actions it intends to take, rather than having it dragged out of them through another urgent question?
Mr Speaker, I won't reiterate my previous answer on the subject of consular access and the challenges that we face in being able to support Jimmy Lai that way. But first of all, I'd like to reiterate the Honourable Member's point that actually so many colleagues across this House have been ardent champions and supporters of this case of Jimmy Lai, and indeed of his family, as they seek to make sure that his case is understood across the world. So we will continue to call for Jimmy Lai's release. We consider the national security law needs to be repealed, and those are messages that we will continue to highlight with the authorities at every possible opportunity.
Tim Long.
Speaker, can I thank you personally for granting this urgent question today, because this pantomime trial of Jimmy Lai is just the tip of a huge iceberg of the CCP's industrial-scale abuse of human rights and indifference to the international rule of law. And today, parliaments around the world are expressing their solidarity with Jimmy Lai and the oppressed freedom-loving people of Hong Kong. But I ask her again, there must be consequences. It's no good just monitoring human rights sanctions across the globe. She has had years to name some of the legal and other officials of the Chinese government who are absolutely undermining and abusing human rights as we speak. When are we going to see action, and what is she doing to address the concerns about the continual erosion of the judicial process in Hong Kong and the involvement there of British judges as well? We need action, not constant warm words.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we continue to use sanctions tools across the police on every opportunity where the evidence comes to us and we can use that, bearing in mind, as we always say, and I'm sorry that it's very frustrating for colleagues, that we will never discuss potential future sanctions designations because it could indeed reduce the impact. We will be always listen to and look at very closely the evidence brought to us, and indeed the work that our teams across the world do to try and be able to bring to bear, using the sanctions regimes that we have, those human rights violations that we are seeing.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. As we sadly predicted, the people of Hong Kong have seen their freedoms systematically eroded since the national security law was introduced in 2020. Pro-democracy activists like Jimmy Lai have been detained. Public libraries have been emptied of books seen as promoting so-called bad ideologies. And the recent Patriots-only local elections saw opposition candidates banned from standing. So can the Minister please explain how the UK government plan to uphold its commitment to human rights and freedom for all Hong Kongers?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right. It has been tragic to see the disintegration of all those freedoms which we considered when we both signed up to the Sino-British Joint Declaration that China was going to stand by. But of course, when we saw both the national security law coming in, we responded very quickly and decisively, particularly with the new immigration path for British national overseas passport holders, so that we could really provide that security for those who felt under most stress. And of course we suspended the extradition treaty with Hong Kong indefinitely to provide protection for those. We have of course also extended our arms embargo on mainland China to cover Hong Kong. But as the Honourable Lady says, this is both a tragic situation and one that we will continue to call for change for, the opportunity for the Hong Kong authorities to reverse the national security law and restore those freedoms which were part of Hong Kong's extraordinary opportunity for economic success as well as other things.
Bob Seeley.
Speaker, given everything that is happening with China, including this pitiful show trial, isn't it now time that the government of this country develops a coherent, proper cross-government strategy for dealing with China, because it is patently lacking at the moment?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we set out in the integrated refresh review published in March, China's challenge to both economic and global security is one that we consider to be right at the heart of the challenges we face, and we are continuing to work closely with officials and indeed G7 and other partners around the world to make sure that we work in concert to tackle some of those.
Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware, I hope, that Timothy Wynne Owen KC, who is part of Jimmy Lai's defence team, is currently in Hong Kong, but because of the failure to give him a visa to deal with Jimmy Lai's case, he is not able to appear for Jimmy Lai. Will she make representations to the local authorities as a matter of urgency that surely the right to appoint counsel of your own choosing is a fundamental in any fair legal system, and that we would expect that opportunity to be given to Mr. Lai?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, China's MPCSC interpretation of the national security law at the end of last year stated the Chief Executive would have to certify whether an act or issue involving national security, including the question of overseas lawyers' participation. Otherwise, their statement was that the Chief Executive-led National Security Committee should make the decision. So attempts to challenge this have sadly failed, and the High Court has noted that Hong Kong courts have no jurisdiction. But we have called on the Chief Executive to respect those rights and freedoms in Hong Kong and indeed to uphold the rule of law as we all understand it.
Sir Julian.
How many times must a totalitarian communist state behave like a totalitarian communist state before the government will recognise it as a totalitarian communist state?
Mr. Speaker, I don't quite know how to follow such a articulately put question. The right honourable gentleman highlights, I think, one of the many challenges of those of us who believe, uphold and indeed want to allow other countries around the world to uphold those values of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of association, and we will continue to work with allies and partners to highlight and indeed to sanction where we can and have the tools to do so those who continue to breach those freedoms.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to Jimmy Lai's UK-based legal team? However, they have very much been subject to incredible levels of cyber and other forms of harassment and interference while they have been working on his legal case. So can I ask the Minister, what is she doing to work with other departments to ensure that those lawyers and journalists involved in promoting and advocating for freedom and democracy around the world are protected from such unacceptable levels of transnational repression?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. There has been some shocking attempts to dissuade, to make fearful and indeed to stop Jimmy Lai's legal teams here in the UK from getting on with their job, which is defending his case and indeed raising the issues that we have set out today. We work very closely, as do his lawyers, with the Home Office and teams to support them and other parts of government to provide them with some of the technical support that they need, and we will continue to do that. It would be a question to pick up in more detail perhaps with the Security Minister, but I can ask that she be able to discuss it with him if she would wish.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. 10 days ago, Jimmy had a birthday on the 8th of December. He is 76 years of age. He's not a young man. It's not being rude about him. He's not a young man. This House can send a message to the rest of the world through an EDM process. There was an EDM which has been laid on the 13th of December by the Honourable Member for Strangford. More members need to sign it. I'm not going to give the honour of other people outside this chamber who want to decry EDMs, the fact there's not that many. If we want to send a message, there's a methodology. It's not the only one, and I know lots of colleagues don't like signing EDMs, but on this occasion, perhaps they should.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. The tools that we have at our disposal here in the Motherwell Parliament, which allows for freedom of speech, for freedom of expression, are incredibly important. And perhaps, as a minister who spends a lot of her time on the other side of the world, in countries large and small, I am very conscious that the parliamentary messaging that comes from here is heard loud and clear in every other country, and perhaps we forget just how important our voice is in standing up for the values that we believe in.
Okay. Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Lai's detention is a shocking symbol not just of the erosion of human rights, but also of freedom of speech and expression in Hong Kong. Given everything that we are seeing unfolding, could I ask the Minister what steps she is taking to ensure that we are supportive of what remains of a free press in Hong Kong?
Mr. Speaker, as Jimmy Lai attests, and he of course has been an extraordinary champion of species, he chose to continue to do that despite the changing landscape in Hong Kong. We continue to support those across the piece, indeed many of whom have come to the UK for sanctuary, to be able to speak out, to use our freedom of press to be able to share their concerns and highlight the abuses that they are seeing.
I join calls for Jimmy Lai's release. Jimmy Lai is a devout Catholic, and his faith motivates his courageous campaigning for democracy in Hong Kong. After the sustained dismantling there of freedoms of expression, association, the press, judicial independence and others, does the Minister share my concerns that the threats to freedom of religion or belief in Hong Kong are now very real? And if she doesn't share my concerns, would she please read the new report by Hong Kong Watch, Sell Out My Soul, the impending threats to freedom of religion or belief in Hong Kong?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend continues to be an extraordinary champion for freedom of religion and belief in her role, and of course I absolutely agree with her. We continue of course to monitor freedom of religion and belief in Hong Kong through our regular 6-monthly reports to Parliament and indeed interactions with local faith leaders. The latest report published on the 19th of September noted that religious practice is not generally restricted in Hong Kong. There are a variety of religious practices coexisting across the country, but she's also absolutely right that I think the strength that Jimmy Lai seeks and finds through his faith is an extraordinary one to help him in this very, very difficult time.
Speaking, and congratulate the right honourable gentleman for securing the question. Jimmy Lai has many supporters here in the UK, both Brits and those from Hong Kong. But many have experienced intimidation and harassment from the Chinese Communist Party here in the UK and face certain persecution, arrest and detention if they're forced to return. But 12 activists have recently been told by this government they are not at risk and had their asylum claims rejected. Can the Minister explain UK government policy on whether Hong Kong campaigners should qualify for asylum in the UK?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Absolutely, as I set out earlier, we brought forward the BNO, British Nationals Overseas route for Hong Kong residents to come to the UK. So far, approximately 191,000 applications have been processed. 184,700 have been granted. The point to which the honourable gentleman mentions is one that I am aware that the Home Office are looking into. There has been a change in the age of the processing, and I think there is an issue there which I know that they are looking at the moment, so I'll ask the the Home Office to update him once they finish their review.
Sir Robert Butland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A regime like this has to be judged not on its words but on its deeds. And in its systematic demolition of the rule of law and now the independence of the legal profession itself, which was such a lively part of an economically successful and prosperous Hong Kong, China is demonstrating its real intentions. What more can the government do, not only to take direct action by way of sanction against individuals concerned, but also to make the strong point that the basic law is not an historic document, it is a living instrument, and we expect it to be adhered to.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend highlights an issue with which he is very familiar. He practices the law, and indeed he is absolutely right. The judiciary and the legal profession and those who are servants of it do so in order to assure the safety and the rightful outcomes of cases. And we will continue to challenge the Hong Kong authorities on the failures of the national security law and call upon it to be repealed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rule of law and how this is upheld across the world is absolutely essential to our global security and peace. And Mr. Lai's case just shows how fragile that is. So what more can the government do to reassert the importance that we all abide by the rule of law?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and much of the work that our diplomatic teams across the world do is in countries where the rule of law is not necessarily adhered to, where there are abuses, human rights violations and so on. We continue to highlight and challenge those, working alongside international partners to persuade those leaderships to change their ways and to both understand the merits of a legal system well delivered, and indeed the value that has to the credibility to their political leadership of their nations. It's something we do week in, week out. Sadly, there are many countries across the world where these challenges continue, but it's right at the heart of the diplomatic services work.
Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The use of international lawyers has been a long-standing practice in Hong Kong, and we have failed Mr. Lai. Would the Minister advise exactly what steps and when those steps were taken to secure or attempt to secure international legal representation of the British citizen Mr. Lai?
Mr. Speaker, as I set out in answer to an earlier question, Jimmy Lai obviously wanted to have his own choice of legal representation. He has a fantastic team of lawyers here in the UK supporting him. The challenges of those who are representing him at the trial is one that we continue to highlight. As I set out earlier, the frustrations on the way their system works means that he doesn't have the international lawyer of his choosing with him, but we will continue to highlight those failings and what we consider to be, as so many colleagues have highlighted, what the right use of the legal system and that independent representation should be.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every reasonable Democrat will be happy to support the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green's plea on behalf of Mr. Lai. However, there's a whiff of hypocrisy in the air. In 2021, former Ambassador Craig Murray was imprisoned on the fabricated conceit of jigsaw identification, and Julian Assange has been held in Belmarsh prison for 1,300 or more days. So will the government lead by example and desist from harassing journalist Craig Murray and others and free Julian Assange now?
Quite sure that meets with what we were expecting. So I'll tell you what, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Minister, whilst I'm very thankful that the Foreign Secretary publicly acknowledged the case of Jimmy Lai at the United Nations in February 2023 and reportedly raised the case with Chinese officials during his visit to Beijing, the fact is that a British citizen remains behind bars. Can I gently remind Right Honourable members of EDM 213, they might want to add their names. I'm asking that the Foreign Secretary, with the voice of the entire British government, including our Prime Minister and this House, should call for the immediate and unconditional release of Jimmy Lai as he spends his 1,000th day behind bars. Will the Minister be prepared to do that today and to follow it through tomorrow with appropriate channels? Thank you.
Mr Speaker, may I first of all say that the Honourable Member for Strangford is the most incredible champion of so many for whom the challenges of freedom of religion or belief continue to blight their lives and those of their families, and who he is always willing to stand up for them. I think, Mr Speaker, that I am not allowed to sign an EDM on the basis that I am a minister, but should that be the case, should you wish to change that rule, I would be extremely happy to sign this. This is an EDM which I think all members of the House that are able to do so should do.
Obviously, I can't sign the EDM either, so, you know, I've got to say the girl guiding one can't sign that, but I'm sure other members would wish to. Right, let us move on.